Welcome, friends. How you doing? Dave here for this week's Griscom stream. Hope you're doing well wherever you're at. Stoked to be here. A lot of breaking news coming out right before we went live. Sorry for the delay. Want to make sure I had all the information that was needed to jump in. We're going to be hanging out, as folks know. These are more casual, so feel free to jump in with any questions y'all got in the chat. I'll try to answer them, but there's a few stories and things I want to get to. So we're going to be diving right in. But feel free to jump in with any thoughts or comments or anything on these subjects. We're going to be talking a bit about some news, some things happening in Tennessee, some recent decisions from the Biden administration, some unfortunate failures from progressives, and then towards the end, I know I'd pitch this as being solely about this, but we have to talk about these other things today. I want to talk about ideology in the working class and sort of pushing back against some of these kind of like pop left ideas about class consciousness, and about like the ability of working people to understand the world around them, that I think are very anti-solidaristic in nature. And I told folks, if you missed the conversation we had on that Left Reckoning's main show 112 this week, I told folks we'd be coming back and talking about it more theoretically. But folks, before we get into all of that, I mean, we have to talk about what's happening right now in Tennessee. So again, if you know, if you've been watching Left Reckoning, we've been covering this, that there was a protest last week, and in support of gun reform in this country, and it spooked the right wing in Tennessee. It spooked the GOP, and they have now taken it upon themselves to expel members of the Tennessee state legislature. As far as I know, and people keep me updated because this happened literally minutes before we went live. They have already expelled one member, Justin Jones, who will be playing a clip from in a second. I can't imagine that he'll be alone in this. More likely than not, the other two will be expelled as well. If you're able to, as we're doing this, if anyone has an update, please share in the chat too. If there's any news on the state on the expulsion of those other two legislators. And I mean, look, what is there to say about this other than what we said on Tuesday? The fact is that this, more than anything, is the most clear stepping on basic democratic rights, right? We talk about gerrymandering, we talk about how difficult it is to vote, and all those things are bad for democracy and are definite threats to democracy. But this is as naked as it gets, right? If you're expelling people for effectively holding a position that you disagree with and being mad at people for protesting against something that should be seen, not to be too starry-eyed about this, should be seen as an activity that any member of anyone who lives in a democracy should see as very, very valid and reasonable activity for people to take on. Throwing people and throwing them out of their position because you have a majority in the legislature, because they were participating in protest. I mean, it's as naked as it gets. It's a very clear power grab. It's clearly anti-democratic. And at this point, this is, we did a whole episode on Reconstruction recently for patrons. This is exactly the kind of moment where you need to have federal action. Like, sorry, it's as simple as that. If you cannot sit here and allow, in this case, 200,000 plus people, the people who are represented by those state legislators who are going to be thrown out of their position. You can't have democracy when people just are going to have their votes thrown away, right? Their ability to decide who they want to represent them. You start allowing that to be chipped away at, the game's over, right? It's over at that point. And, Sleepwalking Joe on this has been truly, truly infuriating, knowing how for the past 7-8 years we've just been hearing about democracy is in crisis. This election is about our democracy. You got to vote this way or else democracy is going to disappear. Well, here you have people in power, right? In a system like we have in the United States, where you have state power and then you have national power, where there's a discrepancy where in the state of Tennessee, the Republicans are in control, but on the national level, the Democrats are in control. This is exactly the kind of scenario that when people say, you got to hold your nose and vote one way or the other, right? Because there are real fights that are happening. This is exactly when you need to start seeing some action. The silence going into this from the Biden administration is a dereliction of duty. and we're going to talk more about what Joe Biden has been up to in just a second. But before we get to some of y'all's comments and stuff on this, I wanted to play a short bit from Justin Jones, who is now, as I was just saying, has been expelled from the legislature in Tennessee. And if you watched the episode on Tuesday, remember that this is somebody who was also assaulted by a Republican member of the state legislature earlier this week. Literally hit. I mean, I'll play that video for y'all just again in case people haven't seen it, and then we'll get to the most recent video here. So I'll just play the very end of it. This is Justin Jones recording here, and he gets assaulted. He gets hit by another member of the Tennessee legislature. So right there. So again, what we're talking about today again is not the person who's being expelled, is the person who literally attacked another member of the state ledge, right? Literally, that's on video, right? That person's sitting pretty in their position of power, but somebody participating in a protest is thrown out of their position. It's just absolutely clear assault on democracy. And here's what Justin Jones said earlier today before he was expelled, when he was when he was speaking to the body.
Let's talk about expulsion. For years, one of your colleagues who was an admitted child molester sat in this chamber. No expulsion. One member sits in this chamber who was found guilty of domestic violence. No expulsion. We had a former speaker sit in this chamber who is now under federal investigation. No expulsion. We have a member still under federal investigation. No expulsion. We had a member pee in another member's chair in this chamber. No expulsion. In fact, they're in leadership, but in the governor's administration. And so once again, what you're saying to us, since you're trying to put us on trial, I'll say what you're really putting on trial is the state of Tennessee. What you're really showing for the world is holding up a mirror to a state that is going back to some dark, dark roots. A state in which the Ku Klux Klan was founded is now attempting another power grab by silencing the two youngest Black representatives and one of the only women, Democratic women in this body. That's what this is about. Let us be real today.
I mean, you want to. I mean, it's as simple as can be at this point. When it comes to being fit for office, there are some very legitimate questions to be asking about others in the body, and yet they're not the ones who are being investigated. They're not the ones who are being expelled. People who participated in a show of the way that many Tennesseans feel about gun laws in that country, the way that many Tennesseans feel about the lack of influence that they have over the people who are sworn to serve them, right? Those are the people who are being targeted. Those are the people who are being attacked. Not folks involved in a manner of anti-human crimes, in profane behavior, etc. It's as clear as day, and you really cannot make any kind of excuses about what this is, other than just a very, very clear power grab. And again, when you see things like this play out in Tennessee, and you're sitting there in a position of power in the federal government, you absolutely should be way more involved than we've seen from the Biden administration so far, especially given the promises and the way this is sold to the American public is that we're going to push back against this threat to democracy. What we have seen time and time again from the Biden administration and from the Democratic Party at large, I'm talking about the big Democratic Party here, they are very willing to let poor and working class people suffer in parts of the country that are not rewarding them with electoral victories, right? Because it serves as an incredible whipping up moment for their base in states that they do firmly control to say, look, what's happening in Idaho right now? Oh, look what's happening in Texas right now. Look what's happening in Florida right now. Look what's happening in Tennessee right now. That's what happens when you don't show up for us. Now, for all those people who are suffering under it, we're not going to show up and fight for them, right? Well, we'll say something on MSNBC in an interview. But when it comes to actually taking on this very clear anti-democratic force, it's crickets. It's crickets. It's cowardice. And it's a willingness, though. I want to be very clear about this. It's not just, oh, they don't have the balls or they don't have the tenaciousness or the spirit or the will to do it. They are very willing to let things like abortion be taken away from people, to see things like this where it's very clear that democracy is under threat and let that dissipate because it's good for them. It's good for them because they're not in politics to fight for working class Americans. They are in politics to maintain their position of power and their influence and benefit their donors and this kind of rising influential class of upper middle class voters that's becoming more and more the backbone of the Democratic Party. Sir Lava Rock says, I appreciate the super chat there, says, in the next few years, at least one Republican state will empty every seat held by a Democrat. I mean, look, at a certain point, do they even need to? I mean, I'm not doing a Texas episode, but what we've been seeing even from the state level Democrats here in the state of Texas has been pretty miserable in terms of their willingness to push and fight back against a lot of these things. I know we're talking about serious stuff, folks, but I did not cut my hair. It's just I just put it up. But I mean, solidarity with our friends in Tennessee. I know a lot of people are organizing. There was massive protest at the Capitol again today. There's a lot of people who are thankfully trying to draw a lot of attention to this. I think it's gotten more attention than none, which is good. I think it should be at the front page of all of these major newspapers. It wasn't when I checked this morning. This is so much more serious than whether or not Trump paid hush money to a porn star. I'm sorry, just clear as day. You want to sit here and talk about democracy being under threat in this country, and you sleepwalk through something like this. It's hard for me to trust your motivations in talking about that. We'll be trying to cover this. I mean, again, if people are watching and if you have any info on the other two, if they have been expelled, I would love to hear it. But I know that we were going to sort of do this more of a Q&A and talk a little bit more generally about working class politics in this country. So I'll be happy to read any comments or questions on this before we move on. But if we don't have any, I want to talk about another thing that happened right before we went live here on Left Reckoning for this week's Griscom stream, which is another decision from the Biden administration, right? What's the other, massive fight that we're seeing people's lives being threatened? We're seeing families being threatened with being ripped apart by, bigots who have way too much power all across this country. And the issue I'm talking about here is trans rights. Well, when it comes to fighting for that, just like it comes to fighting for the people in Tennessee, um, more active at least than in Tennessee, but negatively, Joe Biden and the Biden administration. This is breaking just 45 minutes ago, Washington Post. Schools may bar trans athletes from competitive teams, the Biden administration says, but Title IX proposal would forbid blanket bans. So they'll sit out that fight, right? Something that, when we were first covering this like new upsurge, and it's always been here, anti-trans bigotry in this country, but certainly the Republicans see that this is something they can do to whip up their people around, something that they can use to terrorize everyday folks in this country. And it started with the question of sports, right? Should we have gender segregated sports? Is it fair for certain people to compete in certain events, etc.? Right. And it was one of those things. It's like, oh, maybe there's a debate on that, right? Maybe it's a fair debate, right? Reasonable people can disagree. Very clearly, very quickly, it moved from beyond the school sports question to whether or not they think people like this should exist in the first place, right? Which is why when all that stuff was going on, the people should have been more farsighted in recognizing that this is just an attempt to get their claws in this fight and try to eradicate, demonize, and take away basic rights from folks. And again, you have the bad man's gone, orange man's gone, Trump's not in power anymore. And what's the Biden administration's decision? How do they want to participate in this fight that is very clearly becoming life and death for people? I mean, extreme how quickly this fight over trans rights has moved in this country in a negative sense. What's the intervention that we're going to get from the Joe Biden administration? Y'all can do what you want. We're going to sit this out, right? That is the decision that you're getting from this administration that is fighting for democracy, fighting for their life, fighting against this scary radical right. Is acquiescence. Open up the door. Y'all can do what you want. We don't care. Especially if it's not happening, if it's happening in a quote unquote red state. Those people shouldn't have lived somewhere that doesn't have a favorable electoral map for us. I mean, it's disgusting. And if you think about it, we talked about 2 weeks ago, this shift in action from the Biden administration is getting worse really, really quickly. In addition to this decision on trans rights, right, which is just, again, like, you can't sit these fights out. You can't be issuing guidance right now when it is very clear that the Republican Party is not satisfied with just bans on trans athletes. They are literally trying to eradicate people's rights to express themselves how they want to pursue medical treatment if they need to. Here in Texas, they're trying to deny the right to transition, not just to minors, right? Again, it was, should young people be able to, make decisions like this, right? It's always how it starts. Well, now anyone under 26, legal adults, people who under our legal system have the full rights to be able to make decisions about themselves and their body, a bill goes through the Texas Senate that denies them that right until you're over 26. It always starts in things that seem relatively small, and it accelerates really, really quickly. And there has been a lack of care and a lack of fight from the Biden administration. On top of that, as we've been talking about, expansion of drilling rights on federal lands for big oil companies, right? That's the fight. That's the change. That's the defeat of the right. Doing more. I mean, people probably remember we would play this on TMBS a lot. I've played it many times. After Obama is out of office, talking to financial interests and oil and gas interests, saying, I did more for you than you ever could have imagined, more than any other president in history, right? That's what you're getting for the Democratic Party. False fight, giving the opposition everything that they want. On top of that, something that we've covered a lot on this program, and I say it with frustration, because it's something that as it's cooking, I felt I was talking to myself, because I don't know if it's the YouTube algorithm, I don't know if there's just a lack of interest in these kind of things, but there was silence on a major decision by this government, again led by Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, to take away Medicaid funding, SNAP benefit funding, and to pull back the federal portion of Medicaid spending that goes to states, meaning that most state budgets are very, very tight, meaning that you take away federal money. That means that what? The state governments are going to be forced to make cuts, right? Unless they cut from something else, or they raise taxes, or they do something else, they have a budget shortfall when it comes to providing health care to poor working class people. As somebody who grew up on food stamps, as somebody who utilized Medicaid as a child, knowing what this means for people like me, I guess, who are undeserving because we live in red states, means that these kids get kicked off of their health care. It means that mothers who are trying to have children in states that are now taking away the right to abortion, so mothers who might be being forced to have children are losing those kind of funding and care that they may need to be able to they can deliver a child safely. That's going away. SNAP benefits are going away. And where was the fight here? Was a truly disappointing moment. I think it's certainly like it's infuriating and it's frustrating from Joe Biden and we know what the Republicans are doing. It's disappointing to see, though not surprising, that Joe Biden and the rest of the centrist neoliberal Democrats are going to be pushing this. But where were the progressives on this fight? Right? AOC was the only person to vote against these cuts. Rashida Tlaib voted present. This was not a question where, the obstructionist wing of the Democratic Party, the cinemas, the mansions were the ones who were in control. No, this was something that the Democrats put forward and they voted for, and they took those rights away. And there was very little fight from the elected leaders of the DSA. There was very little fight from a lot of progressives. I know folks were covering this, shout out people like at the Lever who are covering this, but that was a really, really quiet thing. I'm putting this whole thing, this is infuriating to watch sort of slow roll right now. That we can sit here and say that we're growing a progressive movement, that we're growing a left in this country, and to see a massive pullback of benefits for poor and working class people in this country. There's no leadership on that, right? This should have been a national issue. This should have been something that people were well aware of, right? We had a hard time getting anyone to tune into any of our coverage on this. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that as excited as we all are, and as good of a thing as it can be, independent media is operating under a logic, just because of the way that it gets delivered to you, unless you're actively seeking these things out, it's not gonna shoot up a coverage of a labor action or conversations about labor unions or conversations about SNAP and Medicaid benefits. It's gonna find, all right, there's a conflict between personalities. That's why if you go on your YouTube, I have the same thing right now. You go on those on to your homepage, almost everything is like, this person said this and this person said this. We're gonna create a drama. Those are the things that blow up, right? Because as great as it is that we have more and more people who might be editorially and independent, they're swimming in waters, they're playing a game, they're having to utilize systems that don't privilege and don't support and don't get the most eyes on stories that you maybe as a creator think are the most important stories of the week, right? It's bad. I think it was a really dark moment. Following up a really dark moment when you saw the progressive movement in Congress line up with Joe Biden to block the rail strike. Again, only AOC voted against this, and even still, we should have seen much more, not just coverage from the media, but hell, this should have been something that was made into a bigger issue by progressives in power. It's dark, and like I'm tired of the arguments that you get from people who want to say that, like, well, I don't think that everything's fine, but like what we have to do is sort of be passive or junior members of this Democratic Party coalition in order to get change and to prevent these bad things from happening, or at least to lessen their blow. When you see time and time again, when these fights come up, the progressives in Congress, and even just like the progressives in this country are all over the place, getting worked up about all of these other fights when there's very clear material things that are happening right now. And what's the point? What's the point of this movement if it can't do something as basic as saying, yeah, hey Biden, I don't think that we should throw millions of people off of Medicaid because you want to go up there and say that the pandemic is over, right? Because somehow you think that's going to help you win Republican voters, right? They think Joe Biden is like the second coming of Stalin. And he's saying, you know what, we're going to make the Trump, you know what we'll do? We'll make the Trump immigration policies effectively permanent, right? We'll put our own spin on it. They can use an app, right? But we're going to deny asylum seekers coming to the United States as not a timed policy like it was with Trump, or was attached cruelly, cynically, evilly to COVID. We're just going to make that our policy permanently. We'll take that away from COVID, right? Isn't that what y'all wanted? Right? It's like, no, what we wanted was the end of the racist and anti-human and basic um, denial of human rights to deny asylum seekers in this country. We wanted that eradicated, not the fact that it was attached to COVID. I'm not happy that you made that permanent, friend. It's rough. It's really rough. And I think that, you know, if you ever needed a kind of wake up moment to sort of look at the movement that's being built, to see if it's effective, to see if it's strong, to see if, like, there's been a lot of fights we've been engaged in on this program, personally, as a, in our own capacity as members of these organizations, that we need to have, stronger relationships between electeds and the base. Um, Watching progressives and particularly DSA elected sleepwalk through a massive Medicaid and SNAP benefit cut. I don't know, man. That sort of, I think, really proves a point that if we don't start changing this, all that we're going to have is some kind of distant figures who, will do good things from time to time, but will participate in the same kind of thing. And that's not good enough for working people. And it also doesn't put us on a level that is going to be successful. I mean, fuck, if you think that, we're going to be able to fight for Medicare for all, and we can't even fight to prevent Medicaid and SNAP benefit cuts, damn, we got a hell of a lot more work to do. And a lot of it is structural. A lot of it is in the way that we are organized, in the way that we engage with each other, the way that we engage with elected officials, having some kind of more general sense of purpose than some kind of loose, oh, that's a progressive, right? They identify as this, right? I don't give a shit about what's in your heart or what's in your feeling. I care about what you do. And the only way that we're going to be able to flip that is if we get much more serious about building up some kind of structure and organization that is able to demand that things like this don't go through, because that is devastating to sit here and watch. Well, folks, sorry, I'm heated. I'm mad. It's just like you see something like this, and it's just like, the thing is that, like, there's so many cynical ways of engaging in politics, I find, right now, because one of them is to ignore this kind of thing and make excuses, right? And I think we all know how we think about that. We're done with it. The other one is also something that I find to be the height of cynicism, where you see things like this happen and you're like, well, I knew, or always knew. It's like, well, we all knew. We all have been talking about this. The difference is that there's a certain segment of people out there who have larger audiences, and they talk to folks, and all that they want to do is to be right. Don't get me wrong, we all like to win an argument, right, and make a good point. But at a certain point, you have to be asking, what are you asking us to do? And effectively, a lot of the more cynical members out there don't really have much out there other than saying, I just want you to be mad about this. I want people to do something more than that. I think that you should be looking around you, looking about the organizations that you're members of, and saying, are we building up movements that are class rooted? Are we building movements that have real grassroots, rank and file engagement, so that we're not just sort of hoping that DSA electeds don't sleepwalk through a massive cut in benefits to working people, right? That's what I want people to take away from this. Not just becoming more cynical and more demobilized and more depressed. You should be angry, and it's very reasonable to feel depressed about these things. But if sorry, it's hard. You have to be able to get up and fight and push back. I know that there's no easy answer. That what we can't do anymore is convince yourself that you're going to do the same thing as a bunch of other less engaged people, but you just have the right perspective on what you're doing, right? And that's your activity. No, like, it's very clear right now that it demands so much more, because you can get rid of the Republicans on the federal level, right? Like they had for multiple years under the Biden administration. You can lose the House. Um, but what came of that? Did we set was there a lot done to really set working people up for a better future? No. And as we're seeing right now, any kind of sense of return to normalcy it was one in incorrect analysis and is evaporating before your eyes as you see the Biden administration basically, offer up a olive branch to the right wing that is trying to eradicate trans people, and then refuse to participate, refuse to fight back, as you're seeing a very, very clear assault against democracy, like what we've seen in Tennessee. And now we're seeing the Democratic Party just internally, right? Again, like this isn't, oh, the Republicans made them do this. I think something like 7 Republicans voted for these Medicaid cuts, right? Not because they cared about Medicaid or SNAP, because they were going to vote against the Democratic Party proposal. So this is something that is internally constructed within the party, and that's what they put forward and did. Let's we're going to get to this more broad question, but let me make sure I'm not missing any of our friends' conversations before we get to talking about ideology and stuff. Okay. I think this is sort of a general human thing. Bill Bradley says infighting is common because people need to feel like they are getting wins. I'm not even talking about infighting when I was talking about progressives being all over the place. I mean, like, don't get me wrong, that's there, but sometimes it's just like, no, totally. If you have a large group of people, there's going to be in internal fights. That's a whole other conversation. I don't disagree with your point here. What I was getting at was more that like there's no real focus on anything, right? It really can be all over the place in terms of involvement, engagement with politics, and that's not good for building a movement. And that comes again out of like not that people are like stupid or or getting distracted or blah blah blah. It's because there's a lot of people feel like they don't have a lot of structures to involve and engage themselves in politics. So they so they turn inward and they get into weird little fights and blah blah blah. Appreciate SRD Law PLLC says, love your hat, Dave. I do appreciate that. Yeah, it's 1970s. Found it at a thrift store recently. Very happy. Actually, recently I got it probably 7 years ago. Awesome Possum asks, is there any way people who don't live in Tennessee can help? I mean, I think immediately is continue. Like this is one of those things where like continuing to like not let this fall underneath the billfold on the the newspaper is something that is desperately needed. I think that like, trying to make this into an issue and start demanding the federal action on this, I think is a way that you can help. If there's more direct ways, I know that there's like GoFundMe's for the politicians. Who knows if that's something people find worth doing. But if any of my Tennessee friends here or maybe listening later have anything, send it to me and I'll shoot it out to folks. Jeff just says, honestly, the lack of pushback on the back of rolling of these benefits is a function of the left's overall lack of engagement on COVID politics itself. Well, I mean, I don't think you need to, to even be talking about COVID when you're recognizing something like, like I've talked about this in the state of Texas, for example, that like you saw, positive health outcomes here in the past few years when it comes to, certain levels of mortality that affect working class people. And it's like, well, why was that? It was because a lot of people were able to get healthcare because of Medicaid expansion, particularly poor mothers. Right. So, I think that this is like beyond even COVID stuff. Like this is very basic that these things, instead of being rolled back, should have been made permanent because they worked and they helped people. Um, like a lot of COVID policies that, gave more money to programs that people utilize and need, these things should have just been made permanent. Instead, there's a desire for Joe Biden to say, I beat the COVID-19 pandemic, to roll back things that help people. Okay. let's get to talking more broadly. I mean, if anyone has anything more to say about this, we can talk about it. But I promised it. I've been, prepping for it. I wanted to talk a bit about ideology and the working class, and some of these things that I see a lot that sort of frustrate me. And this is zooming out, but again, it honestly, it gets to a lot of these issues that we're talking about with the failures of not only the Biden administration, but I mean, even clearly like the democratic socialist movement in this country, where this is again like what we're talking about here. When you're not seeing progressives and DSA electeds leading the fight against cuts to Medicaid and SNAP benefits, and allowing, pulling back federal funding for Medicaid. So like it's not even just a question, for example, so like obviously in a state like mine, right, where they won't expand Medicaid, um right, which has like dramatic, like you can see them in health outcomes now, what that means for people, effects. So the big cut is going to be toward working people in the South and working people in quote unquote red states. But even beyond that, because the federal government, even in states that had expanded Medicaid, had increased the portion of money that the federal government was giving to those states, it also means that states who are run by Democrats in the rest of the country are going to either have to make the decision to start culling and pushing people off of the Medicaid rolls. Um, because they won't be able to afford it, or to cut other programs, or to raise taxes, or to move things around in the budget so that they can continue to pay for this, right? So this is a national decision. It's not just something that affects the South. um, the fact that we didn't see this become a rallying cry for progressives, but at a certain point, we've seen time and time again from the way that Jayapal has conducted the Progressive Caucus, that a lot of these commitments are shallow, right? And when they get pushed back from the National Democratic Party, they walk back. But if anything, like if there's the value of having elected Democratic socialists in Congress, is so that even if you can't win, we're continuing to build, like even if you can't stop these things from happening, you're building up a consciousness of the activities of the US government, both factions, the Democratic and the Republican Party, in their war against working people, right? And if you just can, and we just can't allow them to continually fail, to make this into a fight, to make this into an issue, to try to build up a movement that says no, that has the power and the capacity to say no to this kind of thing. You has to be building some form of class consciousness in this country, and it's just not happening at the level that is necessary. It's not happening at the theoretical level that is used to justify, these activities. And like, look, I'm still somebody who thinks there's a lot of value in having people, high profile representatives of the movement, right? Um, I'm somebody is very willing to be critical of them, but I think that there is value of having people within the state, who can warn us about things that are happening, that can fight back, and that can continue to deliver and build up a consciousness amongst people in this country that there's a different way of doing things. In general, like that's my position on these things. In practice, and what we're seeing right now, it's very clear that it's not happening at the level that it should be, right? And that doesn't mean that you eradicate and run away from the strategy at large, but you recognize that something ain't working, and things need to fundamentally change in the relationship between these people, and their membership. And I honestly, like, I can already tell where I'm going with that. I wanted to really focus mostly on this false consciousness and ideology thing. Maybe we'll get back to that in a second, because I know I've covered that time and time again. But I wanted to, like, I'm gonna have to just take a step back, because like I'm heated about what's happening right now. That sometimes it's hard to talk more broadly and more theoretically about these things. So let me just start over. We're going to use some terms here: ideology and false consciousness, and it's tough because one, with in terms of like false consciousness, people have like context clues as to what that means. We're going to try to really hammer out what that is and what that's about. Ideology is another one where there's a kind of general understanding. Oh, ideology is like, okay, you can have a libertarian ideology, or you can have a socialist ideology, or you can have a neoliberal ideology. Um, I think that instead of thinking about it as purely like a kind of unified sense of ideas about the world, think about it more as a process, as a structure that comes to justify the really existing material and social relations in society. And as we'll get to with Marx and Engels and the early Marxists like Lenin, ideology was primarily utilized to talk about the bourgeoisie, right? The ruling class, right? Ideology being like the big ideology, the ideology that sort of like justifies society as a whole. And rather than being utilized as a tool to sort of keep people in the working class mystified and confused, it was rather something that was produced by the ruling class for their own consumption. What do I mean by that? Ideology, in the more traditional, more historical Marxist sense, is used to sort of say, how does a liberal, right, or in like the 1800s, who owns a factory, justify concepts like equality under the law, with the inequality of um, the social world, right? The inequality in the economic sphere, right? You have bosses, you have workers, right? How do you justify that? That's the ideological production that we're talking about. So it's a product, it's something that is produced by the ruling class for their own consumption to help them sort of justify, accept, and feel okay about their relationship and their role in the world. um and yeah, so like when Marx and Engels are writing about ideology and false consciousness, they're more writing about the bourgeoisie and the superstructure, right? Which is sort of sits on top of society, culture, the law, the state, right? Builds off of the base, which is the fundamental material reality, the material conditions in society, right? How are we socially organized? What's your relationship to production? How do we produce things? Who's able to extract surplus value? Who's able to benefit from the labor being done by people? That's what we're talking about here. If you've watched some of our Marx theory readings, we've done things where Marx was very critical, for example, of like the young Hegelians, um, because the young Hegelians sort of misinterpreted, misunderstood, misrecognized the product that they participated in creating. The young Hegelians, it's like a philosophical movement of intellectuals, academics. Marx was a young Hegelian before he famously broke with him, went from being an idealist to a materialist. If you want to see that, you can go check out our theory reading videos. They're up on YouTube right now. If you want to jump into that more in depth. But one of the things that Marx ridiculed was that, all these reformers within that class, right, within that movement, they misrecognized the fundamental aspect of ideology and what had been created, right? Again, not as a product that was produced by them for their own consumption, but rather something that could be sort of ripped apart by like a spicy pamphlet or like an article that uses high phrases to sort of attack these things. It's like, no, the way that the world is governed by the fundamental material reality, and the material reality then creates the ideas about the world and the ideas about society. The young Hegelians, a lot of the liberal tradition, always thought that you can attack the ideas and that's going to change the material world. Marxism generally rejects that concept. To put some more meat on that, Marx in the German Ideology wrote, for each new class which puts itself in the place of one ruling before it, is compelled, merely in order to carry through its aim, to represent its interests as the common interest of all the members of society. That is expressed in an ideal form. It has to give its ideas the form of universality and represent them as the only rational, universally valid ones. And you see this in the way that capitalism is talked about, that the way that liberal democracy is talked about. So these are like universal, when we know in practice these things are very classed, right? You can say that you live in a free democracy, but you don't have freedom. That freedom is evacuated the second that you step into work, right? You live under a dictatorship. So these the dictatorship of the bosses, the dictatorship of capital, So these kind of ideas, this ideology is something that, again, is brought up for consumption of the ruling class to make their particular interests, their particular wants in society appear universal. But mainly, it's not for the workers, the working class, the oppressed people in society. It's consumption. It's for the oppressors to consume that. Lenin, for the most part, participates in a very similar build off of Marx, right? Where he talks about some different forms of ideology. For example, in the left, he calls one like the trade union ideology. There's the reformist ideology. What is the reformist ideology, according to Lenin? What Lenin's argument there is that the reformist ideology is to try to incorporate the oppressed, the working people, into the capitalist system, right? So that they have like a stake in it. Maybe it's just solely ideologically. Maybe it's because they get some level, but through their participation in that system, mainly politically, they have some buy-in into it. And he counterposes that to like the revolutionary um, ideology. But even that debate, Lenin makes the argument that um, like the reform versus revolution ideology is mainly produced more by intellectuals than something coming from the working class itself, right? It's the way to sell two different kinds of programs, two different kinds of strategy. And the real fight in the working class is less so between reform versus revolution, for example, but rather between short and long term interests. And let's zoom out for a second um, to sort of get why this matters and what we're talking about here, because we're going to get into some of the different shifts in ideology. The reason we're talking about this, the reason I think it's important to sort of look into what's happened in the way that the left sort of views ideology, the way that the left views class consciousness, is because in the 70s and 80s you start to see this, and the the priming starts way before that, but you see this particularly in like the new left, and then in the kind of left that develops towards the decline of the Soviet alternative. This like fixation on culture, right? It's movies, it's television, it's culture that is basically keeping the working class from participating in and being members of a socialist party, being members of communist party, fighting for revolution, right? People are so bamboozled, they're confused. Oh, I don't understand myself, I don't understand the world around me, and it's because they're watching too much television, right? And there's an aspect to this. There's no doubt about it that like culture and art and media play a role in trying to form some level of consciousness. But again, like you're seeing the product, you're seeing the thing that comes out of the class struggle, or in more accurate in more accurate cases like the United States, the destruction of the class struggle in the sense of like the dominance of the ruling class. You're seeing the product, right? The result of that kind of where the class struggle is at. Um, Being reflected in media, being reflected in culture. So it's not saying that like, oh, cultural criticism is necessarily bad or wrong. It's not saying that there's nothing there that you can look at. But you're sitting there just like the young Hegelians were, thinking that like, well, if I have the right criticism of television or of movies, we can start to pull back these layers of confusion and ideology that have sort of bamboozled working people. This has been something that's been a major part of like the Anglo left. I'm talking about the United States, UK for a while now. There's an aspect to this too that's like even less socialist, Marxist in name. I mean, this is like new agey stuff, right? Hell, you can look at the like the in the contemporary discourse, the weird kind of manosphere online right. What do they talk about all the time? The Matrix, right? There's this world around you, and it's meant to deceive you and confuse you, right? So there's an aspect to this kind of criticism and this understanding of consciousness, and like the manosphere is not trying to build class consciousness, but like this kind of like idea that most people are sleepwalking and are asleep, and we're going to wake you up, right? You're going to unplug yourself from the matrix, right? There's an aspect to this that is even less attached to like the historical development of like socialist thought, socialist theory, that's just sort of like a pop idea. And this was where I think it gets really dangerous in the contemporary context, because it's something that so many people, I think, are well versed in, just sort of by being in and about like American culture, the way that people sort of think of the world around them. It has really negative consequences, I find, um, for politics. Um, and you see this in the way a lot of people talk about ideology. The concept of ideology has been a bit inverted, right? Instead of being seen in the traditional Marxist sense as the idea of the ruling epoch to justify itself, it's again like seen as this like spell that's like put upon working people. I hope I'm not doing too much prep here, but I hope that if maybe by going through some of the history, we can get to, I can talk more freely about what's happening right now. Um, so for Marx and Lenin, ideology has a very particular role for the ruling class, again, like to justify itself to itself. Um, and especially when it comes to Lenin's stuff, Lenin was not one of these people who thought, I think that one of these ideas that's very popular on the left right now is that like workers have a false view of capitalism. Rather, they just have a limited one, and the role of a vanguard party, the role of a socialist movement, of a communist movement, is to develop that understanding, rather than to introduce it in and of itself. And like you can make the argument like this is the reason that why Gramsci and why a lot of these later thinkers become so dominant and interesting to folks, is because Gramsci, I think oftentimes is wrongly maligned or wrongly thought of because he is so beloved by a part of the more, like, I don't know, culturally interested, the more philosophy interested, like Marxists, as somebody who sort of like was rejecting Lenin and Marx. But don't forget, I mean, Gramsci was like somebody who was a Leninist, and a radical communist, and a radical Marxist in a way that's very, very different from a lot of the new left thinkers who then sort of become the people who deliver Gramsci into the academy, particularly in like the English speaking world. Um, but Gramsci's stuff, I think, is even not well represented. Because like sorry, and I didn't even talk about false consciousness. False consciousness is one of those things, a lot of people attribute it to Marx. Marx was not really somebody who wrote and talked about false consciousness a lot. The kind of pop general understanding of false consciousness that we're going to get at and critique today is this idea of false consciousness being like you don't understand your own interests, right? Because like you're mystified by the world's confusing around you, so you act against your own interests, right? That's a famous kind of term, right? People, oh, worker, this person's voting against their interests, this person's not acting in their interests. And a lot of this false consciousness stuff is sort of like attributed to Gramsci, but contrary to, I think, a lot of the ways that Gramsci sort of represented, um, um, Gramsci makes a very clear distinction that like false consciousness is really a in the same way that Marx was saying is something that is experienced by like the bourgeois and the ruling class. And in any case where like working people are experiencing some level of false consciousness, they're not experiencing it in the same way as the bourgeoisie, because where there's undeveloped consciousness in the working class, they still understand very, very clearly that they are living in a system that is not set up for them to thrive, right? So that's not a false consciousness. If it sort of develops into like other kind of political activities that you might not see as like revolutionary, radical, or socialist, but it's undeveloped, it's an underdeveloped understanding, right? But it's there, right? Which is different from a false consciousness. And like, why is this? Because workers are oppressed by the system. They recognize their oppression. And what is the role for Gramsci? What is the role for Lenin? What is the role for Marx of Marxism and the socialist movement? And what is the role for the party? Is to draw out and develop the real insight that working people feel, right? That's very different from sort of waking somebody up and pointing, oh, you thought you were living in a just and fair and free world, right? In a democracy. You don't anymore. You don't, and here's why. No, what these folks are saying, mainly Lenin, I think Gramsci, you can make a case as well. I think Gramsci is very misused and abused today. Um, is that like the role of the socialist movement is to develop and draw out that understanding that you are on the bottom rung of society and that the system is set up to continue and make permanent your oppression. And look, that's a very different kind of conception, that I think is really popular today. That treats, from liberals, and I think a lot of socialists get this. A lot of it comes from the fact that so many people who consider themselves socialists today might have been liberals like 5 years ago, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's great, but that also means that you should be, constantly checking yourself, and your understanding of these things, and recognizing where a lot of these ideas that are popular in kind of like American society, that are popular, particularly in like ruling class society, that are sort of presented to you through liberal intellectuals, through the media, that you might sort of see as like true, are really just examples of liberal ideology that has sort of maintained itself within your own understanding of the world. Right. So the Gramsci point is that like people understand that they're oppressed. Maybe some of that, the full understanding, the full scope of it is not as developed as we would want it to be. In fact, that is the job of the socialists or the revolutionary party. Right. That's all the way back to Marx. Is that the question is not convincing people that they are oppressed or abused, but it's doing this collective work, right? And it's also not coming down from up high as like the enlightened individual who understands the world coming to the rest of your coworkers and friends and community, but rather understand that this is the collective process of trying to understand the world around us, the scientific work of trying to understand society, politics, and the economy, so that we can take the feelings that we have, the true recognition that we have, and put some theoretical backbone on it, some historical backbone on it, so that we can better understand the nature of oppression, exploitation in the system, with the goal of changing it. That's a very, very different mindset and perspective than this kind of pop false consciousness, right? That it understands the world, treats workers as if, that treats workers as if they're like mindless slaves to ideology, and they're bamboozled and mystified by the world. And the task of revolutionaries and socialists is to harness this organic development of ideological and practical real world resistance to capitalism and bring it to its fullest potential. Um, so let's develop this a little bit more. And before I jump too far, I want to make sure I'm not missing too much from the chat. And like, I'm not even going to do Frankfurt stuff. I think that the Frankfurt school, you can have you should give them a more sustained critique than this, but you can see this retreat to class, I mean from class into culture, did way more to demobilize, and disorganize the left than it did to sort of build us into some kind of new um, radical movement. um Jay says, I feel like this stems from a deep. I think you're talking about something I was saying earlier about the misunderstandings of Gramsci, saying, I feel like this misunderstanding stems from a deep misreading of Gramsci and his reference to culture. He's not referring to pop culture. He's talking about people's practices and values. No, yeah, he's talking about the Catholic Church. He's talking about the law. We're talking about a larger superstructure than just like maybe culture in the sense of like you're a culture editor at a magazine and what that means you review TV or movies, right? It's like the actual process of the world around you and how you're engaging with that. I think that's very fair. But like at the same time, what is the church in America? But the media and these kind of things. I mean, these play massive roles in our kind of community and our general sense of ourselves, that I don't think that you can separate as neatly as we may like. But no, you're 100% right that Gramsci especially is talking about the Catholic Church in Italy, um, which had a very, very powerful influence on people at the time. Okay. I'm going to keep on taking questions and stuff. I'm just making sure that I'm not missing anything that would derail us later. Um, all right, so we can get to maybe the other side of this. So, I mean, like before this, like let's get to the crux of why I want to talk about this because I see this all the time from folks. In like, here's an example. We talk about this with this like Marjorie Taylor Greene interview on 60 Minutes. It's like we all know what 60 Minutes is. It's not a place to go to get class consciousness. This is not me coming on here and being like, this was a great segment. This was a great piece of media or interview with this person. But I saw from more people than I would like this kind of idea that like, well, if people see this, right, they're so kind of confused um, and um, mystified by the world and they're all just going to become MTG fanatics. And look, there are people in the working class who, like her, right? I think that it would be wrong to overstate the amount of support that people like her and even the Trump movement at large have there. Um, but, that's already there. The idea that like people are unable to sort of understand their own world, like you would treat people with kids gloves, I find to be a really, really anti-solidaristic um, idea, right? And maybe more practically, it's like things like fake news, right? The liberals love fake news because they can't look toward material politics to sort of see why these things are breaking down. I mean, why is society breaking down? Why is society in crisis? Because we're seeing, for example, in the United States, like life expectancy is dropping for working people, right? That is a real, like in your life, you can see that things are getting worse, and there'd be monsters in social collapse, right? And without the engine, without the vehicle of a class-based movement, you're going to be trying to look for not just answers but activity. And the fact is that without class consciousness, and what do we mean by class consciousness? Class consciousness is more than just like the recognition that like you're being screwed over by your boss. It's the recognition that you are a member of a class that is historical and is contingent on the development of society, on the way that we produce things in the current American society. People resist capitalism all the time. People resist capitalism all the time. How do they do that? Individually. Um, is it always effective? No. Is it always directed in the correct way? Absolutely not. But in the absence of a class-based movement and a class-based organization, something that you can sort of participate in and fight and get gains for yourself and your family, people are forced to participate in politics individually, and that's where you can see things. Um, develop in the kind of nasty ways that we've developed. Think about all the ways that capitalism pits workers against each other. Great example. Ready? We talk about it. Reserve army of labor. A Marxist concept. The people who are sort of pushed out of the labor market. What are they utilized for? They're utilized as a threat against you. If you quit, if I fire you from your job, 10 more people can take this. I've experienced that, when I was working, in the restaurant industry. Very clearly remember complaining to a boss one time and they just pulled out a binder of resumes and they put it on the desk and they said, this is a problem, this is where, I will go. And I said, have fun with that. And I moved on. But look, the fact is they replaced a job. That place didn't change. Right. And I was out of work for a period of time. That was extremely damaging to me. What's happening there? Myself and all those other people who are, in that binder are competing against one another, right? That is what happens when we're operating individually. You see how this operates in like the union movement. That's why we've developed terms and concepts like "don't be a scab," right? But even then, what are you trying to do there? You're trying to put social pressure on people, to deal with this. Again, something that's happening on an individual level. I need a job. I need money. I'm trying to find a job, right? Capitalism is really good at pitting working people against each other. You can see that at industry from industry. You see unions competing with other unions for certain kinds of work. You can see, for example, how for some workers, like immigration can be damaging because it means that like jobs that they do. They're competing against a larger section of workers, which means that wages can go down, right? So if you're sitting on this as an individual, right, instead of sort of saying these capitalists are the ones who are screwing us over, we should be building a movement to sort of fight their power. Oh, we need less immigration in this country, right? This is the point here, is that contrary to the kind of pop understanding as to why we don't have a class movement in this country, why we don't have revolution, why we don't have all these other things being ideological in the sense of like people are mystified, they don't understand their own interests. No, somebody who's taking that position understands their interest. The problem is that interest is expressing itself as on an individual level, which is pitting themselves against the other members of the working class, right? It's not a fully developed class consciousness, right? But it has a material basis. It has a material basis versus something that's ideological, right? Because the material basis is the power that bosses have over us, the ability that they have to, for example, to be able to hire under wage for certain kind of jobs, right? These are material problems that reflect themselves politically. And if you're still thinking about their existence solely as an expression of thought, right, on the level of this person has bad ideas or this person is confused, right, you're missing the way that capitalism operates, right? You're over determining, you're focusing too much on ideology, right? Oh, well, there's a nativist ideology in this country, instead of seeing why is this ideology produced, who produces it, and for what purpose. The nativism becomes a very helpful excuse for certain members of the bourgeoisie to sort of say, like, you're upset about the fact that we've offshored like industry has closed down all across this country. It's the immigrants, it's the dangerous politicians who are doing this to you. It's not me, the capitalist, right? Like, these things have a material basis, and you really need to start to reckon with that if you want to change it. So how do we get out of that is the fundamental question. So the idea here is not that there isn't a need for political education, that there's not a need for argument, that there's not a need for conversation, that there's not a need for writing about these things, talking about these things, producing media that maybe can help explain some of these things. But rather it's saying that these things, rather than being, the fact that we don't have a working class movement in this country because like workers in this country are confused about the world around them, they don't understand the world around them, is incorrect. If anything, people understand all too well that this system isn't working for them. But what we have to do is develop class consciousness. And what that again means is not just like a different way of arguing, but actually building significant and serious working class organizations that can not just make the argument to their friends and coworkers, but actually fight back against the bosses. Because like you're only going to get so far, no matter how rhetorically finessed you are, no matter how penetrated American mass culture is with certain ideas, until those organizations and those fights start happening, the material basis that leads people to make those decisions, that actually puts things in people's interests, to wage war against each other as a working class, we won't get far at all. Okay, let's see. I'll be down to do some questions on this. I'm sure I have um, some more thoughts on this. Kilgore Trout says, tried to unionize a restaurant in my early 20s, and oh boy, was I naive on what we were up against. I mean, look, this is something I think the whole left is experiencing collectively, right? You see how popular unions are with people, right? Was it like 70% of people want to be in the union, and you look at union rates in this country, right? It's because, like, again, beyond these sort of being like, oh, we have to sort of re-educate people and push back against anti-union stereotypes and attacks. I think that that's a worthwhile engagement and investment of your time. But no, yeah, the reason that we don't have stronger unions in this country is because capital was able to wage a very successful material war against the conditions that allowed for high rates of unionization in this country. So we have to find ways to get around that. Western chauvinism is the word of the hour. So anytime, yeah, sorry, I don't know what that's in reference to. Our friend D Waffle Baker. Sorry if I said that wrong. Says, "Hey Dave, love your shirt. Those magnolias, they're agave flowers. I'm wondering what's a good jumping in point to develop the academic side of my understanding of these movements. Movements. If you're still watching, maybe follow up with what you mean by movements. I'd be happy to suggest. I think one of the best people who's been writing on this wrote a book very recently is Vivek Chibber. He has a book called The Class Matrix. We need to get him on the show, maybe to do an in-depth interview with. You can watch many of his interviews on the Jacobin YouTube channel, Vivek Chibber. But The Class Matrix is a recent book of his. I think is really good to sort of jump into this. Jeff just says nativism is also in people who aren't poor, though, so I don't think that helps Dave's argument. Well, one, did I say that ideology exists solely for working people? In fact, I was saying that ideology, first and foremost, um, is a product of 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 the ruling class for the ruling class's own consumption, right? Um, so no, I mean, I don't understand the criticism there at all. What I'm saying is that the participation in something like that from a working person, rather than being a kind of mind virus, is actually something that is reflected and cultivated in the actual material reality around it. Now, you can say it's an incorrect analysis, and I would tend to agree with you on that, right? I don't think that nativism is a particularly productive way for the left to go. It divides and encourages war against working class people from working class people against other working class people, right? But what I'm saying is that these are like based in material reality, based in the way that we produce things, way that we have to survive, way that we have to engage in competition with one another. That's why these things exist. And the ideology, the justification comes second. Ruling class has the same kind of dynamics within itself, right? And you see the ruling class is divided on the question, for example, of immigration. There are certain capitalists who prefer over other ones, right? So I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't accept the idea that because the ruling class has these tendencies means that they're that saying that people in the working class have them is wrong. I don't understand. I'm sorry. Oh my lord! As much solidarity as I'm trying to show with our friends in Tennessee, I'm not going to accept any confusion. You see how this is a strong orange, right? It's not like, oh, I can't decide what color I want to be today. Orange. That's the University of Texas tea, not the University of Tennessee. Oh, since we were doing theory and have done Luxembourg recently, have you? Will you read any of Lenin's responses to Luxembourg on stream? And we could. I mean, I think we're going to do a longer Lenin section. I'm Lenin. I mean, citing Lenin earlier. I'm like, I would consider myself generally, a Leninist. Um, I think that when it comes to the question of democracy, Rosa was right, and I think was shown to be right historically. But it'd be fine to do that sometime in the future. So Secret Asian Dan says, David, can you make a more pointed distinction between not fully developed and against their own interest? It seems like one can be a euphemism for the other. So what we mean by that, they're talking about um, consciousness, like class consciousness, not being fully developed versus being against their interest. The point that you should be asking yourself is that when you see, for example, um, working class people engage in politics that might seem anti-solidaristic or even reactionary, instead of thinking that like better, ask yourself, why is this interest being expressed in the way that it is by working people, right? So as I was just saying earlier, the nativist thing, that's an example of like seeing an interesting, I'm being exploited, my wages are going down, my living standards are going down, I need to do something about it, right? Which is uh, a consciousness of the fact that the system's not working for you, a consciousness of the fact that like even capitalism may not be working for you, but it's not fully developed. Therefore, you're not recognizing who. And I actually, you know what, thank you for asking that, because it missed I think one of the most important aspects of why these things are not fully developed, because they don't get developed into who the enemies are, right? The enemy is the capitalist class, the enemy is capitalism as a system, not particular capitalists, not oh, this is a bad capitalist or this is a good capitalist, right? Which is where a lot of these things end up. I don't like my boss, but some bosses are probably good out there, right? That's an underdeveloped consciousness on these kind of things. On the against their interest, it's sort of recognizing, why do people express their interest in the way that they are expressing them. Matt Karp had a really great piece in response to Dylan Riley in the New Left Review. I'm forgetting the title of it, but it's in the most recent one, where he talks about some of these working class communities that have swung hard for the right, like in like not like in like a decade, right? And why is it expressing itself that way? Because a lot of people see themselves as participating in a politics that is waging war against a certain part of the elite, right? And a lot of like the working class support for Trump has to do with that, right? Is sort of seeing this well-off, well-to-do class that doesn't have their interests at heart either. Like the Democratic Party, as we were talking about all day today, does not have the interest of working class people at heart. It doesn't. It just does not. Um, so this is something that can be utilized to sort of weaken the position of people who we see as having an antagonistic interest as us. So we're going to wage war on this section of the ruling class, right? You see that all the time in like the more working class support for Trump. It's like, we're going to come after the rich folks in our community who are fucking us, and the rich folks in your community more often than not are coalescing around the Democratic Party these days. All across the country, that's happening. Where it's beneficial to them, especially, right? Because the ruling class wants to get favors and benefits from the government. If you're in a state like Texas, um, you know, uh, there's a large part of the ruling class is also not united too. I think this is one of the things that's really important to recognize when we're talking about class politics and the American parties, is that like there's certain sections of the ruling class that benefit more from Republican policy and Republican politics, and there's certain sections of the Democratic Party that benefit more from Democratic policy and Democratic politics, right? So you're recognizing, okay, these are opponents of ours. We're going to do something that they don't like. That's how we're going to engage in fighting. Like their interest is to fight against the rich and powerful in society. It's an underdeveloped consciousness because they're doing it in service of somebody like fucking Donald Trump and his whole coalition and constellation of extremely nasty anti-working forces in this country, right? That's what we mean by underdeveloped. But if you're going here, it's like, oh, these people are confused about things in the general sense of like they don't understand what it is that they're into, versus something versus sort of recognizing this isn't an expression of a consciousness that's saying, I'm being screwed over by the system, I'm being screwed over by society, but because it's underdeveloped, because there's a lack of class consciousness, not just like internally but like generally in the society, it's going to direct itself in a whole bunch of different ways. And the role of the Socialist Party is to build class consciousness, because here's like another aspect, like of the equation too, is you also have folks out there on the left who like think that um, working people are imbued just by the very nature of being with class consciousness, with the revolutionary mentality, right? That's not true. That's just not true. And no one worth their salt in the Marxist or socialist movement has ever really seriously argued that. They've always said these are things that are very likely because of the way that society is set up, because of the fact that if you're a worker, you're going to be exploited by the ruling class. That this has the potential to build a class not just of itself but for itself, right? um and the role of the socialist movement is to develop that kind of consciousness, to develop those kind of organizations that can deliver on those kind of things. So I think that it's really wrong to sit here and say, well, these people don't understand their interests. Rather, you should be asking, why are these being expressed in the way that they are, and how can we build something that can pull them over, to our side, to an anti-capitalist side, instead of just finding, in the way that it's expressed now, is finding sections of the ruling class to sort of wage war on while benefiting another section of the ruling class, if that makes sense. And Strom said it well, as he tends to do. Says workers know that they're being screwed, but a basic understanding of the fact that one is being screwed is not mature proletarian class consciousness. Yeah, and it's something that has to be built, just like anything else. Bill Bradley says, I point out that the Frankfurt School is rooted in Western exceptionalism. Yeah, but I mean, I would add to that though, fair enough, but it's other lineages. We're very happy to incorporate other traditions into their model, and they've been just as weak as well. All right. I know I'm a little bit behind y'all. Um, all right. Let's see. Um, I'm just trying to. Have I considered collaborating with JT from Second Thought? I'm not sure if I know who that is. Sorry. Send it to me. I'll check it out. Bill Bradley says the Bolsheviks built class consciousness in part by infiltrating places of work and organizing workers and using that as a platform for education. Yeah, I think that this is also like is something that is until the socialist movement in this country becomes more oriented and based in labor, we also won't get anywhere, because if you're not there every day, and you're just popping around every once in a while, you're not going to get very far. Um, Vex says, doesn't the fact that we're literally out of time affect the way that we should approach movement building? Well, one, I don't think we're out of time. I mean, if I'm assuming you're talking about the climate crisis, I think that there's always opportunity to build a better future, and I don't think that you can start getting into those kind of perspectives. And there's also a whole world out there that wants to sort of, I don't know, sensationalize. And it's not saying that climate change isn't real. It's just like um, there is a kind of like it's a really pessimistic. There's a really pessimistic outlook out there on like how we deal with climate change. It's really demobilizing and demoralizing. Beyond that, I would say like I highly agree with something that Leo Panich once said, that like we can never give away the ability to think in the long term in terms of building movements, because this is always because one, the kind of like 10 seconds to midnight mentality of a lot of the environmental left hasn't gotten results, because again, like most of the non-socialist like environmental movement refuses to take into consideration like the real engines as to why we're not able to deal with climate change, which is like the financial interest of the capitalist class. That's starting to change now, but it's pretty late, unfortunately. Um, we have to be able to think in terms of movement building, and like this goes all the way back to Marx, right? Marx understood that this was not something that you're going to be able to do in a week or a year. It's something that's going to take time. Doesn't mean that there's not victories, that there's not mobilizations, that there's not things that we're going to be able to achieve in the near term, but like the whole thing is that this is a process to change from a capitalist system into a socialist one is something that is going to take time. It has to be developed. I mean, this is like OG Marxism right here. So we can't deny our horizon to ourselves. It's a huge strategic mistake, because if you lose the ability to think in 10 years, then you won't be able to develop the things that we need to see in, like, for example, in 10 years, right? Like, think about something like, I mean, like, one of, like, it's dark as fuck. But like one of the things, like in the UK in like the 2010s, they were saying things like, well, we can't build nuclear plants because nuclear plants are going to take 5 to 7 years, and by then we'll need much more done. And of course, nothing happened in terms of decoupling from fossil fuels in that country during that time period. But Lord, we'd be in a better situation had the investment been made then into building up these kind of systems. And we might look back 10 years from now saying the same thing if we don't. And that's not just about nuclear; it's about like all sorts of different aspects of decoupling. But we have to be able to think in the long term. I don't think that you can drop these things. All right. Thank you, Learda. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. All right, folks. I might see if there's any last ones. Yeah, I mean, I mean, like, but what tactics? I mean, if you're talking about the left hasn't even been on the national stage except for maybe partially with Bernie, and even that was something that was much more filtered and focused through him. I mean, I'm seeing a left wing movement participating in politics on the national stage. We haven't seen that because the capability and the organization necessary to do that hasn't been developed at all. Jeff says, asked who was the person David just referenced regarding time and climate change. Leo Panich. Leo Panich. Uh, if I can, I've been trying to find. He said that in a lecture of his. There's like 10 or so on YouTube. So what? That's about 10 hours. I probably have it somewhere. I've been trying to find it. Um, if I can find it soon, maybe I'll do something with it. But you're not going to do wrong by watching a Leo Panish lecture, even if that exact quote isn't in there, because he's talking about that all the way through. And I think this is a good point too. Rob says, I feel like election cycles are a massive tool that promote short-term thinking. I totally agree. I mean, you're seeing this right now with I'm like, well, who's our next Bernie going to be in this next presidential election cycle? And I just don't think that that's where we need to be thinking at all. Vex was responding to what I said earlier, saying that they're not a doomer, and they weren't saying that we can't think in that long term. I appreciate that. I wasn't coming at you. I just responding to that idea in general. What can we do to accelerate? I mean, like the thing that has to happen right now is we need to build a coherent structure and organization, and like putting meat on that. What I mean by that is we need to move from beyond like this like constellation of different people who say I'm a progressive, I'm a socialist, I'm a this, I'm a that, into things that represent those interests on a political scale, on a material scale, on the shop floor, and you're seeing those start to be developed, but You know, those are the but internally, right? You think about an organization like the DSA. There's huge fights, for example, about how can that organization interact with its leadership, right? And I mean by that, like elected officials, right? That's a fight that's going on right now. These most recent examples of what happened, both with the Medicaid cuts, the SNAP cuts, the breaking of the train strike, shows that it has been developed enough, right? So, you know, how can we shift that? These are the kind of more practical questions that are in front of us right now. Yeah, I think Panic is somebody very worth everyone's time if they haven't been watching. All right. Folks, I appreciate everyone hanging out. I'll be back. We have Milton, our good friend Milton Alamati on this weekend for the bonus episode. For patrons, you can become a Left for Reckoning patron right there if you want to use our snazzy new graphic. There's also um, patreon.com/Left for Reckoning is how you get it. We have him on to talk about a really incredible anti-imperialist victory in Ethiopia in the 1800s, a new book that he just has out on that subject. It's always a pleasure to hang out and talk with Milton. So be sure that you check that out. We're going to have Paul Prescott on the program next Tuesday to talk about Tony Mazzocchi, who is a very radical left late an environmentalist labor leader, somebody who should have much more influence on today's left. Now we're thinking about building politics, so we're gonna have Paul on to talk about that. If you don't know Paul, um, you know, is a writer for Jacobin, used to be one of the hosts of the Jacobin Show, and is also, you know, doing the actual work. You know, when he's run for office, but you know, right now he is an organizer with the Teamsters, so always really great to have him on the program. Appreciate everyone so much. Hope you take care, and thanks so much. Oh, and please, I usually don't do this, but please like and subscribe. We really want to be reaching a few more folks because you know, a lot of stuff is getting sort of covered up by the not just the news cycle, but just like the way that these platforms sort of promote certain kinds of content over others. So it'd be really great. The only way that we can beat that, and I don't even know if we'll be able to beat that, but the only way that we can be reaching more people is with your help. So if you're unable to sign up for our Patreon, you know, help us out by spreading the channel, liking and subscribing. It really does help us out a lot. Appreciate all of y'all so much, and I'll see y'all next week.